My name is Thomas Unger. I'm an emeritus professor of Maastricht University in the Netherlands in Europe. And I was the chair, or I'm still the chair of the ISH Hypertension Guidelines Committee. Today, I would like to show you a little bit how we got together, and I will tell you something about the process of writing. You have certainly already heard from our president, Alta Schutte, that these new ISH global hypertension guidelines are different from others, from the clinical guidelines that have been published in recent years by the Europeans, by the Americans, and Japanese and around the world. Most guidelines are very complex, and they are written by experts in the field, but rather for affluent countries. And what we thought our job should be to write something not only for the affluent regions or settings in the world, but global guidelines that could also be used by less affluent or middle and low income countries and regions. So these new guidelines therefore address the topic in a different way. And you will see how we did that. In the beginning, when the president, Alta Schutte, asked me 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, well, would you be willing to chair these guidelines? I thought, well, yes, of course, I do that. But there was also a lot of skepticism that was met. For instance, is it really necessary at all to write new guidelines? We have so many in this world. Is this not a hyper-simplistic view that we want to do them? Is it strictly evidence-based, like the European, the American guidelines, who have dug out a lot of evidence from the literature? And is it helpful for low-income settings and not for the affluent areas of the world? But then we overcame these problems. And we set out for our writing procedures. And we had a first meeting, as you can see, in London, in the UK, in February 19, which was followed by further meetings in Paris, in Frankfurt, Germany, and in Glasgow, in the UK, up to the 26th of February this year. And you also see the committee members. They were selected from the council of the ISH, while thinking of those people who had already experience in writing guidelines, but also clinical experience and theoretical experience and epidemiology and so on. So these 13 people that you see here were selected to be the committee of the guideline attempt. Well, first of all, of course, we had to define our goals. And what we really wanted was not to review the current evidence again, because this has been done by ACC, AHA, the American guidelines, by the European guidelines, and other colleagues around the world. We wanted to develop a balanced, practical, and realistic, and also feasible, hands-on proposal for global use in line with the mission of ISH, which is, of course, a global society. Global use, that was our option. So we had to stick, of course, to recent guidelines because they gave us the background of evidence. But then we defined something very special, as you can see in green essential and in blue optimal, criteria of diagnosis and treatment according to resources availability in low and middle income versus high income settings. I say settings, not countries, because you may have low and middle income settings also in affluent countries and vice versa. So we had to address, of course, practical questions, and always under the idea of essential and optimal. Essential, what is the minimal requirements in countries, in regions, in settings which are not that affluent, and optimal just for the more affluent ones, let's say in Europe, America, Japan also. So you can see the whole list. I'm not going into all these details, but we really made an effort to cover all the fields of hypertension that are relevant to these guidelines. And so we ended up with the contents of our guidelines in sections, as you can see, from 1 to 12. So we defined hypertension, and we went down through all those facets and aspects of hypertension that you can think of, or let's say most of them, of course, with these 12 sections. The review process was twofold. First of all, we had an internal review. So each section reviewed by another member of the guideline committee. And then, most importantly, we also had an external review, 2 rounds with 24 experts around the world, with special consideration of colleagues from the low and middle income countries. And you can see that. So that goes from Sudan over Russia, Mozambique, Cameroon, Singapore, and some European countries, American countries, Indonesia, Australia, China, Japan, and so on. So we really tried with these 24 reviewers in 2 rounds to cover the world and to fulfill our global mission in these guidelines. The publication schedule, as you can see here, on May 6, we have the online publication in the Journal of Hypertension, and concomitantly in the Journal of Hypertension and Hypertension. So 2 journals will publish online at the same time. On the same day, which is today when you see this webinar, we have the first webinar, the global one, and there will also be initiated by our Chinese friends a Chinese webinar, which will be in English and also partly in Chinese. On May 20, we expect to have a second webinar with questions and answers that come from your side. So if we receive a lot of questions, which we hope, then we can do the second webinar and answer online these questions that you may have. We also go for internet and social media, of course. We put our guidelines on the homepage of ISH, and eventually we will also have translations into several languages around the world. So at the end of our guideline paper, you will find 2 pages called Hypertension Management at a Glance. And we again follow our concept of essential in green and optimal in blue. Now, certainly I cannot go through this slide with you, but just remember it's there. You can always refer to it when you read the guidelines. It's a summary of what we say in the paper, starting from the diagnosis over the evaluation of hypertension and diseases which go along with hypertension. Treatment, of course, very important, non-pharmacological and pharmacological treatment, drug treatment, and then also monitoring of hypertension, as much as that can be done in essential settings, minimal settings in less affluent countries. And this is followed in blue by the optimal table, as you can see. Again, the same schedule, diagnosis, evaluation, treatment, and monitoring, but now under conditions that we have, let's say, in several European countries or in the United States or Canada or Japan, where there is more to be done and there are more facilities and possibilities in hypertension management. That brings me to the end. I hope that you will read the hypertension guidelines from ISH, either in the Journal of Hypertension or in Hypertension, or online through the various channels through which we distribute these new ISH global guidelines. Thank you very much for your attention.